we are now. And so the first verse simply says, these are now the chief of their fathers, and this is the genealogy of them that went up with me from Babylon in the reign of Artaxerxes, the king. And then he begins in the second verse, and he reads the genealogy, much like it is in Matthew, when it starts out with the very first chapter in the book of Matthew, and they're dealing with genealogy. Genealogies, as well as names, were very important to the Hebrew. If you would name something, then it's like that's who your character was, that's who you were, and you lived up to that name. Names were not just given in random like they are here in America these days. I won't say that everyone in America just has a random name, but I have been in the presence of people where they thought a name was cute. It was a mixture of different names, or it's just something that they heard, and so they named their children that. It didn't really mean that it had a meaning or anything. It's just something that they like. Now, some of the names, the kids have to go to school for 12 years to know how to spell and to pronounce them. But nevertheless, they're names here in America. But here, you look at the different names, which we're not going to deal with that tonight. But the issue is that Ezra, a man of God, very, in my opinion, very respected. All of the prophets are respected. But when I think about Ezra, I think about a man that is, in a very positive way, straight-laced and by the book. I was working for a company one time, and there was one manager that was so meticulous that once you got away from the main store book, then he almost couldn't make a decision. And we used to always say there is a time when you use managerial discretion and so forth. But in other words, you have to think on your own sometimes. Sometimes you have to think outside the box. But he was so straight-laced to where sometimes it didn't work. He didn't have proper answers, but we called him, well, I won't mention the name, but we said by the book, and that was his, and they would say his name. But Ezra, not quite like that gentleman was, but Ezra was a man of God, stern about the scriptures. There was no play in Ezra. There was no your way in Ezra. It was God's way, and he loved God. It's not that he was overbearing. It's not that he was unfair with the word. We're not saying that at all. But to me, Ezra represents a real man of God in the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. There in Babylon, after Babylon had been taken over by the Persians, which are the present-day Iranians. And so, if you remember, we said the other week, between the Babylonians and the Assyrians, they were at different times arguably two of the most powerful nations on the face of the earth. Their military might was second to none. But it come a time when the Persians came on the scene and Babylon was destroyed. We know that God sets governments up and God takes governments down. But everything is going to be according to the will of God. I feel like the Lord steps aside sometimes and allows the enemy to come in and to overtake us sometimes, so we'll have a reason to call on him, or he does that to get us back in line, to get us back straight, because evil cannot be found in God. So he allows the enemy to do what the enemy does best, and that is create chaos and just be as evil as he can, especially to the children of God. Now, he's that way to everybody on earth because everybody belongs to God. But to those that are really committed to God, he has issues with them because they're not in line with him. And so it is that that the mid-700s, the Babylonians that came into at different times, both kingdoms, the southern kingdom, the northern kingdom had taken them hostage had taken them prisoners for 70 years. Jeremiah had tried to warn them if they did not change their mindset, they did not change their attitude, they did not change their life and start living for God, that the Lord was going to allow punishment, 70 years. And of course, they were upset with the man of God, with Jeremiah. And so they didn't listen. And of course, the Lord allowed the Babylonians to come in and take them. And then, of course, the Babylonians, because of what they did, and God does this all the time, to his chosen, to the children of Israel and the children of Judah, the time of 70 years, because God is not a man that he should lie. And so after 70 years, God had raised up another nation, another king that were not afraid. I preached a message one time, probably about 20 years ago, that God is not afraid of your giants. And so as terrible and as powerful as the Babylonians were, God raised up Artaxerxes and the Persians, or present-day Iranians. He raised them up, and they marched into Babylon and destroyed Babylon. Amen. We know about the dream that Daniel came and had interpreted from the king of what he saw, rather, in Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's son, what they were doing the night that God came in, how they were desecrating the temple of God, bringing out the golden goblets, things that was used in the worship of the Lord. They had very little use for, and they mocked, and they was full of pride because they felt like we're the great Babylonians. And I say all the time, he should have learned the lesson from his dad, Nebuchadnezzar, about this God. His dad tried to tell him that there's only one God that I can truly recognize as being the one true God, and that's the God of Daniel, the God of the Hebrews. And here, when we look in Ezra, chapter 8, we see how that Artaxerxes, while he was not in what we would call the church today, while he was not a Christian, he recognized, because God has ability, he recognized it was God that had come to him and said, I'm raising you up for a purpose. And what I want you to do is I want you to bless my people and allow them to go back to Jerusalem, to go back to Mount Zion, or to go back to church. You know, I've heard it said for years that, well, what can people in the world tell me? Well, sometimes the people in the world can tell you a lot of stuff. Sometimes they have wisdom, because God speaks to everybody. Remember, he's not a God that's unattached from the earth, from this present world, from this universe, but he's a God that's very involved. Some religions teach that God sits high and he don't get into the affairs of man. Well, in Ezra, we understand very clear that God gets into your business and he gets into my business. Whether we call ourselves Christians or not, whether we're dedicated to church or not, God's going to get in the midst of our business. Even in end time, he's going to get in the midst. The issue is, are we realizing who's there, when he's there, and what he's doing? Artaxerxes realized that what God told him to do, he told him, look, allow them to go back, encourage the ones that want to leave Babylon, that want to get back in church, that want to go back, allow them to go back. And because I blessed you, now I need you to bless them and be able to help to build Jerusalem back. It's not that he was going to ever become a worshiper of the Lord, a true consecrated man of God. He was never going to become that. But the one thing he did do, he did respect the not just wishes, but the directions, the instructions, and the command of God. It's a lot more than we can say for a lot of people, for a lot of the others that were still in Babylon that refused to go back. And so the first verse here says that these are now the heads of their tribes. God always chose a leader in each tribe to represent the tribe. That's why it's so important to be in place and to learn submission. We always say you can't be a good leader until you become a good follower. You have to have a teachable spirit. And Ezra was a man that was stern enough, that knew the law. He was a student of the law. He was a student of God. And so he records, these are now the chiefs of their fathers, and this is the genealogy of them that went up with me from Babylon in the reign of Artaxerxes the king. You know, in the church,